Welcome and bienvenue and welcome back to the Modding of Isaac with Lyte. And today we're working with orbitals. That's right, things that go round and round. And oddly enough, we're going to use planets to do it. So we might as well just get right into it, see how it looks, and then we'll get to the code to see how it works. So as always, we start with an item in the middle of the room, and we pick it up. Cosmos, the macrocosm, reflects the microcosm. And so we get the Earth and the Moon orbiting around us. Earth is kind of slow, the Moon is going a bit quicker. It's not to scale in any way, shape, or form. But it is orbiting us, and the Moon's orbiting it. And you'd think this sort of thing would take, trigonometry to work. You would need sines, you would need cosines. None of that is actually necessary for familiars. You might need to do that for other things eventually. But at the moment, simple orbiting of familiar orbitals, really quite simple. And then if we go into, say, a room, we can just walk in and hit them with a planet and take them out without too much trouble. So that's basically showing how it works. If we were to give ourselves, let's say a cube of meat. That's there. And if we give item halo of flies, we get 2 flies, and it doesn't interact badly with our planets. Because if we tried to give ourselves another pretty fly, the cube of meat would prevent it from happening. We'll cover how that works not too far into the future, but our planet as it stands did not interfere with the functionality of the normal orbitals. Let's head on over to the code and take a look. So the first step is to make the entities, because anything that exists in the game is an entity of one type or another. If it can move around, it's an entity. If it can't, it's a grid entity. Pretty much anything else, it either doesn't exist, it's a figment of your imagination, or I guess it's a sprite. But these, they move, so they're entities. So you come into entities2.xml, you set it up as we've done several times in the past for familiars and enemies and whatnot. Version 5, mind you, version 5. And then I stole the vast majority of this content from Cube of Meat itself, because it's a good example for an orbiting familiar that deals a bit of damage. So you come in here, you copy most of that. So the anim2 path is where you find what it looks like and how it moves. Base HP, it cannot be killed, it's not a boss, it can't be a champion. Collision damage. For Cube of Meat, that's 7. I didn't want something as strong as Cube of Meat because, as you can see, the Earth is massive, so we dialed back the damage a bit. Collision mass, 3. Radius, 13. Friction, 1. Maybe up this collision radius because the Earth is so big, and maybe cut this radius down because the Moon is so small. Why not? Let's do it. Friction, how it moves through the air, that's fine. ID 3 is crucial because it's a familiar. You need it to be number 3 for it to act like a familiar. Give it a name so she can find it later, Earth and Moon. Number of grid collision points I still haven't tested. We're going with 12 because that's what Cube of Meat had. Shadow size, I kicked this one up for the Earth and down for the Moon because the Earth is so big. Stage HP, again, it can't be killed. And then the variant, once more, we need to set to a constant. So go over to random.org, get a random number between 1 and a billion, right? Yeah, 1 and a billion, yeah, 1 and a billion, and start from there. And then I made the next one larger. Because we don't want these to collide with anybody else who's making any sort of familiar variants. And we can't get the next one in line, unfortunately. And then the jibs, it's not going to die, so these don't matter, but they have to be there or it'll crash your game. So keep everything there, change the things that need to be changed. I'll warn you though, this is not enough to make your orbital block shots. Remember how ball of bandages used to be? Well, that's how the planets are right now. If you want it to block shots, you will need more code than I'm going to show you today. You need to detect whether or not the enemy's shot is close enough to your orbital and then poof it out of existence. Your orbitals don't take damage, they don't get hit, there's nothing that triggers a callback when they're together. So you're going to have to do the detection yourself and remove it if you want it to block shots. Right now, I don't really think the planets need to block shots because they're a little overpowered as they are. And I'm probably going to add more for pedagogical purposes. So that's the entities.xml. It's very similar to what we've done before. You change your collision damage, you change your shadow size, and most importantly, you set the ID to 3, and you set the anim2 path to be your anim2 file. Now we're going to go over the anim2 file, over here in the animation editor. It's a very, very, very simple anim2 file. There are no extra animations. The planets don't move at all. They don't even bounce. If you want things to bounce and you want them to animate, you make more animations and you trigger them in the code. For now, we're just going to stick with idle because we just want it to exist. I grabbed the cube of meat anim2 file, removed the float animation, and swapped out the sprite for my Earth sprite, and then shrank it down. See, the scale is at 30 here. I took this, scaled it down to what you see on the left. You also have to modify the position X and position Y such that it looks the way you want it to look. Yeah. And then down here is the timeline where you actually work with things. So if you come in here and it looks weird, doesn't show anything in here, make sure you select the frame you want to work with. Now this idle animation is triggered by default. There is no code necessary to trigger this quote-unquote animation. If you added more frames here and made it dance about, you can still do that in idle, such that its idle action is bouncing about. Kind of nice. I will eventually get into more detail regarding the animation editor and making your own animations. Just not today. So we've got our anim2 file, we've got our entities too. Items.xml is just you make the item. As we've made items before, it's a familiar, so it triggers the familiar cache. You give it a name, a description, and a picture. Super simple. Now for the code. All the way at the top, standard boilerplate, mod, register, mod, blah, blah, blah. You have a couple of constants. Just like for any other familiar, you need the item, which is the thing they pick up. Get item ID by name, your item. Then you get the familiar variants as you set them in the entities2.xml. So familiar variant.cosmos Earth and Cosmos Moon are set to get entity variant by name, Earth and Moon. These are constants, they do not change. And this way you don't have to remember that number between 1 and a billion that you picked. Don't have to reference it in the code anywhere. Standard first frame, hey, we got the item. And then we've got the initialization and update for each of our familiars. And at the bottom is where we summon them. So we'll start from the bottom and work back up. Just with any other familiar, you do it when you evaluate the cache. When they pick up the familiar item, it'll trigger this cache. And then if the cache flag is cache familiars, then you do stuff. Now orbitals act a lot of different ways, depending on which one you have. So the code I'm going to show you is only for the way I wanted to do Cosmos. It doesn't work the way Cube of Meat works. It doesn't work the way Sack Dagger works. It doesn't work the way Pretty Flies work. So what it does is it checks if you have the item, and if you have it, it gives you 1 Earth and 1 Moon. If you get another copy of Cosmos, you do not get another Earth and Moon. If you want to have multiple Earths and Moons, then instead of using has collectible, you would use get collectible num in place of the number, just like we did with Little Azazel. So if you don't remember how to do that, go check Little Azazel. This is just a different thing if you don't want it to multiply when you get more copies. Because cube of meat doesn't multiply when you get multiple copies. When you have 1, you've got regular cube. When you have 2, you've got a level 2. That's a different variant of the familiar. And then 3 and 4 are also different variants. And then when you have a 5th one, you keep number 4 and gain a level 1. It's quite a bit of coding that needs to go into figuring out what exactly you should get in this function for cube of meat and ball of bandages. Here, it's very simple because you're only ever going to have that 1. As we expand the item, we'll have more interesting checks in here. But for now, 1 Earth, 1 Moon. If for some reason we re-roll and we no longer have the collectible, makes you wonder, will this check familiar run properly? Probably not. So what we need is an else here. Because if you don't run check familiar on it, it's not going to check. So if you have it, you have 1. If you don't, you have 0. I have not yet tested whether or not it treats true as the number 1, like it does in various other languages, but I wouldn't trust it to. So if they have it, 1 of each. If they don't, 0. You have to take into account these sorts of weird situations, because they're not that weird. People re-roll all the time. So, we have created the Earth and the Moon. Now what? Well, then it runs the init. Init. Okay. So, on initialization, Earth does nothing. Literally nothing. There are a couple of things that you would think you would want to do here. You'd want to set its collision class. Well, it turns out, by default, it collides with enemies. You don't need to be explicit. You'd also think you'd set its distance, speed, and layer here. But for some reason, it resets it. I've tried putting this in the initialization, and it promptly ignores it. Goes back to the default cube of meat right around the middle. It's no good. So we can't just set that in initialization and forget it. Doesn't work. Then when we initialize the moon, we do slightly more. What we do is we go through the entities in the room. We find the Earth. So normal for loop, we've done it before. Nothing comma entity in pairs of get room entities. Do if the entity's type is familiar. If it's not a familiar, it moves on right away. If it is a familiar, it checks the variant. And if the variant is the Earth, then we set the moon's parent to be the Earth. Now this only works because we summoned the Earth and then the moon. If we summoned it in the other order, it wouldn't do anything. It would just get stuck and it would not know its parentage and it would orbit around you instead of around the Earth. But setting the moon's parent is what makes it orbit the Earth instead of you. Just that one little line. Well, I suppose it's 5 little lines. And then everything else is taken care of for you using the same code between Earth and the moon. So we've initialized them. The moon's parent is the Earth. Great. Now, every frame from there on into infinity, we update them. We update them the same way, even. So for the Earth, we get the player, because that's what it needs to orbit, and for some reason, the player isn't the Earth's parent. I know, it should be, but it's not. So you get the player. Isaac, get player 0. It's fine. Then we set the orbit distance. How far away from you is its orbit? And you give it a vector. Now, I haven't necessarily tested all of the implications of these two numbers, but I've got a pretty good guess as to what they do. And let's just test it to be safe. I have a feeling, yeah, we want it to be really dramatic, that this leads to an elliptical type shape. But we'll put that in, see what it does. Then you set the orbit speed. 0.01 is the nice, slow movement that we get for the Earth. For the Moon, we have 0.1, which is pretty darn quick. When you get up to 1, it's just whipping around. 1 is way too high. 0.01 is pretty slow. 0.1 is pretty quick. You'll probably want something in between. Then we have the orbit layer. You know how I said it didn't get in the way? Well, that's because of this orbit layer. Everything on orbit layer 0 interacts with one another. So orbit layer 0 is sack dagger, halo of flies, cube of meat, ball of bandages. They're all on the same level. And they all interact. So if you've got 3 things on level 0, you cannot get any pretty flies. If you keep adding things to the same layer, they will array themselves out such that they are evenly spaced around you. They'll start on one side, you add a second one, it'll be opposite. And then you add a third, and it makes the nice little triangle, but you can keep adding from there. If you've ever seen Sack Dagger with many, many, many copies, it just keeps adding and adding and adding. The layer doesn't matter distance from you wise, because you could have things right on top of you that are a different layer. Like, I don't have a really good example, but if you set it to 0, it'll act like the normal right up next to you familiars, but you'll have a different layer for like distant admiration, because if you get 2 of those, they'll start off across from each other, and you keep adding those as well. If you don't want yours to interact, give it a sufficiently large number, and it's unlikely to collide with other players' orbit layers, unless you want it to interact, and then you choose the appropriate layer. So you could have something that is on the same layer as distant admiration. Now, the fun part. You do, in fact, need to tell your orbital to orbit. It's kind of required. It's the worst thing about computers. They only do exactly what you tell them to. So you set the velocity. You're not going to change the position, you're going to change its velocity, because these updates don't happen as often as the renders. So if you set the position, you'll get very choppy and lagged motion. If you set the velocity, it'll be great. So what do we set it to? So we ask the Earth to get its orbit position, which is based on these 3 settings. And a location that you give it. So it gets its orbit position relative to a vector that you give it. So what vector? You give it the player.position plus the player.velocity. So that you're telling it where to be the next time it renders, because player position plus player velocity is where they're going to be next update. So we get the orbit position relative to where the player is going to be, minus where you currently are, because you want to get the velocity, which is the change of your position. So you take where you want to be minus where you are. And that'll give you a vector that points where you need to go. And it'll do that during the rendering. That's where it does the updates to the physics. Twice as fast as the regular updates. And this one line takes care of all of the trig necessary for wherever you need to go. And it holds true for the moon as well. You set up the 3 values, the orbit distance, the speed, and the layer. And then you have the velocity, position, you get the orbit position. Now, instead of player, we use moon.parent, because that's the Earth. Position plus velocity, and then that orbit position minus the moon position. Where you want to be minus where you are is how you get there. And that's all there is to making this familiar. So we're going to save this. We've made some changes to both the XML and the Lua, so I'm actually going to exit Isaac and start it back up again. So the screen might go black for just a moment, but don't panic. Oh, right. And a cute little doo-doo-doo. And it started back up. Now, I just have the habit of going in and turning it off and back on again. It's just a habit. So we're going to see whether or not our hypotheses were in fact true. So we'll pick it up. And now we've got the Earth. It's moving pretty slow, but you can see it comes much closer to me on the top and the bottom than it does on the sides. So when you're setting the orbit distance, you're setting the major and minor axes of an ellipse. Now, unfortunately, if you want to have your relative position different, such that it could precess or any number of other things, you're going to have to start doing the math yourself. You can do an offset such that it doesn't circle around you, but it circles around a point to your left. But if you want precession, you'll have to do a bit more math on your own. But for a basic orbital that has some interesting shape to it, I kind of like this. I kind of like that you can set it as an ellipse instead of as a circle. What was the other change we made? The collision radius. We should probably go and test that out. This is not the place for doing that. I don't care about the key. I want to deal damage! Okay, so it would appear that we have made our collision damage radius too large, because they start taking damage too far away from the Earth. It's pretty good. It's pretty close. But you're going to need to do some testing to make sure it does exactly what you want it to. But all in all, it's an interesting item. Oddly enough, it is weaker than the cube of meat, but it doesn't seem all that weak. Whoa, what was that? So it doesn't seem very weak. It's doing a lot of ticks of damage. In a future episode, I will show you how to reduce the number of ticks of damage, because we're going to want things that don't hurt quite as hard but deal other sorts of effects. And don't reapply themselves quite so often. I'll show you how to do that. I have a pretty solid idea of how that's going to work. But if you have any other questions regarding orbitals, familiars in general, feel free to let me know down in the comments section. But that's all for this episode. I will see you in the next episode of the Modding of Isaac with Lyte.